Hello and welcome to the video about simplifying square roots. If we want to simplify square roots, which means we want to write the square root with as small as possible number underneath the square root, we first have to go back to the rules of multiplying. We know if we do this, the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, we can say that is the same as the square root of 4 times 3, and that is the square root of 12. 4 times 3 is 12. And this one, another example, the square root of 5 times the square root of 6. We can say it's the square root of 5 times 6, and that is 30. Okay, so if we know this, we can also do it the other way around. So we can say the square root of 48, we can also write like the square root of 24 times the square root of 2, because 24 times 2 is 48. I can also write it like the square root of 8 times the square root of 6, because 8 times 6 is 48. Or I could write it like the square root of 16 times the square root of 3, because 16 times 3 is also 48. And maybe you can find other numbers to make 48. So you can write a square root, a single square root, with two square roots multiplied. And the same goes for the square root of 63. I can write it like the square root of 21 times the square root of 3, for example, or the square root of 9 times the square root of 7. Maybe you can find other numbers, but these are two options to write the square root of 63 as two square roots. Okay, so you need this to be able to simplify a square root. Simplifying a square root means writing a square root with a number as small as possible underneath the square root. How do you do that? So you find two numbers of which the product is the number underneath the square root. So we just did that with these two. We found two numbers of which the product, so when we multiply them, is the number underneath the square root here. Two numbers, if we multiply them, we get this number. 9 times 7, we get this number. But we have, if we want to simplify, one of these numbers has to be a square number. So if we go back, a square number means that you can take the square root of it. So I can take the square root of 16, for example, because the square root of 16 is 4. And yes, I can take the square root of 9, because the square root of 9 is 3. So two numbers of which the product is the number underneath the square root. One of these numbers has to be a square number, and then write it as small as possible. So this one we just found out, we could write it like the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. This one is a square number, 16, because we can write this like 4. The square root of 16 is 4, so this is 4 times the square root of 3. And then we leave out the multiplication sign, and we have 4 square root of 3. So this is the simplified answer, or the simplified form of the square root of 48. Write it with a number as small as possible underneath the square root, in this case 3. So let's do a few examples. The square root of 125, I can write like the square root of 25 times the square root of 5. That one I can write like 5, the square root of 25 is 5. And then times the square root of 5, that's this one. And then leave out the multiplication sign, 5 square root of 5. The square root of 32, so I can write this, I can easily see it like the square root of 4 times the square root of 8. And I know 4 is a square number, so I can write this like 2. And then I have the square root of 8. But now we have to pay attention, because this is of course a simplified answer of this. But if we take a closer look, I can also write the square root of 32 as the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. The square root of 16 is 4, and then I have 4 square root of 2. And we had to write it with a number underneath the square root as small as possible. So that is a 2, not an 8. So in this case, this one is not the simplified square root of this one, but it's this. This is the correct answer. And here we can write 252 as the square root of 36 times the square root of 7. And the square root of 36 is of course 6 square root of 7. And this is the simplified square root of this. Okay, but it can be a little bit more difficult when you have a number in front of the square root. So we just simplified this one. We said this was the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. This number we just leave here because we know this means 3 times the square root of 48. So we just write down 3 because that's already here, times, and then we simplify this one, and we knew this was the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. And we know 16 can be written as 4, so we leave the 3, which is the same as this and this, times 4, the square root of 16 is 4, times the square root of 3. 3 times 4 is of course 12, so we can write this as 12 square root 3. Let's do one more. So 4 times the square root of 8. We leave the 4, that's this 4. And the square root of 8 I can write like the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 4 is of course 2. But we still have this 4, so we leave the 4. And we say times 2. The square root of 4 is 2. Times the square root of 2. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 square root of 2. And there we go. Okay, how can we use the simplifying of square roots with other things? So, for example, we see a calculation and we learn that if we want to add square roots, the number underneath the square root has to be the same. You can see already that 12 is of course not the same as 147. Therefore, we cannot add them. But we now know how to simplify square roots. This is a very big number and this one can be simplified also. If we simplify this, we can maybe add them. Let's take a look. So 3 square root of 12, I can write like this. 3 times, that's this 3, the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, because 4 times 3 is 12, so I can write it like this. And then we have plus, that's this plus, 2, that's the 2 over here, this 2. 147, if you think a little bit, you will find that you can write it like the square root of 49 times the square root of 3, because 49 times 3 is 147. Okay, we can write this a little bit shorter, so we know the 3, we just write it here, the same 3 like this one and this one. The square root of 2, the square root of 4 is 2, so we can write 3 times 2 times the square root of 3 plus the 2, which will stay there, of course, 2, 2, 2. The square root of 49 is 7, not the square root, so it's just 7 times the square root of 3. And 3 times 2 is of course 6, and then we have the square root of 3 plus 14. 2 times 7 is 14, square root of 3. And now we have two things that we want to add, and we have to take a look if they have the same number underneath the square root, and they do. 3 and 3. So we can add them. 6 plus 14 is 20. So the answer is 20 square root of 3. So this calculation can be done if we first simplify both square roots and then we can add them. Thank you for watching this video about simplifying square roots.